There are doors in this world that only open one way. The morning I walked my son through the glass doors of Gracewood Hospice, I understood for the first time what those doors actually meant. And I held his arm the whole way through, because I could not hold the truth. My name is Dovie Hale, 62 years old, Nashville, Tennessee. I have buried a husband, survived a hard life, and raised a son who became more than I ever dared to ask God for. Cassius was 38, built from discipline and quiet ambition. The kind of man who returned phone calls and remembered birthdays and never once made me feel like a burden. And on a Tuesday morning, he walked through those doors holding my elbow like he was the one keeping me upright, which, if I am being honest, he was. He did not complain. He never did. When the nurse showed us to his room, he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at me with those steady eyes and said, "Mama, stop looking at me like that." I smiled. I unpacked his bag. I arranged his things the way he liked them and sat in the chair beside his bed and began the work that is not really work at all. It is just staying. It is just presence. It is just choosing not to fall apart in front of the person who needs you whole. The room smelled like clean linen, and something underneath the clean linen I did not want to name. I stayed until he slept. And in that stillness, I noticed the room across the hall for the first time. Door partially open. An old man upright in the bed, hands folded, eyes toward the window, no television. No flowers on the sill, no cards on the wall. Nothing that said anyone had been there or was planning to come. He sat with his silence the way a man sits when he has made peace with being forgotten. I went home that evening and baked peach muffins. I told myself it was something to do with my hands. The next morning I crossed that hall. He looked at me the way a man looks when he has stopped expecting anything from anyone. Cautious, almost confused. I held out the tin and said, "I'm across the hall. Thought you might want some company." He studied me a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I haven't had a peach muffin since my wife passed." I sat down. We talked about Nashville summers, about what patience costs a person. His name was Cornelius. He did not offer more than that, and I did not ask. If you are watching this, and you have ever sat inside a place like Gracewood, waiting, praying, holding someone you love through something you cannot fix, drop your timestamp in the comments. Tell me what time you are watching. You are not alone in this. I returned to Cassius's room that afternoon and found him more awake than he had been in days. He reached for my hand and held it with a firmness that surprised me. "Mama." His voice was low, careful. "I need you to make sure my affairs are in order. Things feel." He stopped, looked toward the window, unsettled. "Ondine knows what to do. But I need you to make sure." I squeezed his hand and told him everything was fine. I told him to rest. He closed his eyes. I sat in that quiet room and told myself he was just afraid. That dying men worry. That this was grief talking and nothing more. I believed that then. By the third day, I could see it happening and could not stop it. Cassius was weaker. Not in the way the doctors had described. Gradual, manageable, a slow tide going out. This felt faster. His hands, which had always been steady hands, trembled when he reached for his water glass. His voice, when he spoke, arrived thin and carefully rationed, like a man spending his last coins. I sat beside him and watched and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would not sound like panic. The nurse on shift that morning, a woman I had seen twice before, adjusted his IV line and noted something in her tablet without looking up. I asked her how he was tracking against expectations. She smiled the kind of smile that answers nothing and said, "We're keeping him comfortable, Ms. Hale." I nodded. I filed the non-answer in the place where fear lives when it has nowhere else to go. By mid-morning, I stepped into the corridor and called Ondine. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been waiting. "How is he today?" Her voice was warm, tight underneath the warmth, but warm. "Slower," I said. "His hands are shaking more than yesterday." A pause then. "I've been thinking, Dovie. I'm going to come to Nashville soon, while he can still communicate clearly." She said it carefully, the way people say things they have already decided. There are some affairs I need to help him manage. Things that need his input whilst he's still able to give it. I told her that made sense. Because it did. It sounded exactly like what a devoted wife would say. It sounded like love expressed through practicality. The way Black women have always handled the unbearable. By making sure the paperwork is right. I did not question it, not once. When Cassius dozed off in the early afternoon, I crossed the hall. Cornelius was sitting up, which had become our unspoken signal that he was open to company. I pulled the chair close, and we sat for a while without talking, which had also become its own kind of language between us. Then he said, "I don't sleep well in this place." "Most people don't," I said. He shook his head slowly. "It's not the discomfort, it's the noise. The nights here are never fully quiet." He looked toward the corridor as he said it, not at me, at the corridor. "People move around at hours they shouldn't. Voices carry through these walls." He paused. "You notice things when you can't sleep." I thought he was describing loneliness, the particular restlessness of a man with no one coming and nothing to wait for. I told him I understood. I told him rest was still rest, even when it was broken. He looked at me for a moment without responding. Then he nodded and turned back toward his window. I returned to Cassius's room at 8:30 to say goodnight. He was asleep. I gathered my coat and my bag from the chair and reached across the bedside table to turn off the small lamp. That was when I saw it, a business card, face up, sitting at the edge of the table, like it had been placed there deliberately. I picked it up. The name on the front meant nothing to me. A Nashville address, a title I did not fully follow. I turned it over, a handwritten phone number, nothing else. I stood there holding it in the dim light of my son's room. Then I put it in my purse and told myself it was probably nothing. I was wrong about that too. Cornelius ate 2 muffins before he said a single word, which told me more about his life than anything he could have spoken. I had brought peach again. Same tin, same kitchen towel folded underneath. I set it on his bedside tray and pulled my chair close, and we settled into the easy silence that had started to feel like its own kind of friendship, the kind that does not need history to feel real. He told me about his wife eventually. Her name was Ruth. She had made the best sweet potato pie in Davidson County, and she had known it and was not modest about it, and he had loved that about her. He smiled when he said it, not a big smile, just the small particular kind that belongs to a man revisiting something irreplaceable. I told him about my years as a school administrator, 31 years in Nashville public schools. The children who came in hungry and left capable. The ones who came back years later to tell you what it meant. He listened the way people listen when they are genuinely interested, rather than waiting for their turn to speak. His hands stayed folded. His eyes stayed on me, except when footsteps passed in the corridor. Every single time, his eyes moved to that doorway, not quickly, not with alarm. Just a slow, deliberate shift of attention, like a man checking something he already expected. Then back to me, smooth, unhurried, as though it had not happened at all. I told myself it was an old man's habit, the restlessness of someone confined to a bed with nothing to occupy him but sound and movement. I told myself that, and I believed it, and I moved on. I should have sat with it longer. Cassius was awake when I returned to his room just before noon, alert in the way that had started to feel like borrowed time, bright for an hour, then gone again. He reached for the remote, changed nothing, set it down. Then he said, "Has Ondine called you?" "We spoke yesterday," I said. He nodded, looked at the window. Then, "Has she called today?" There it was, the same question, different coat. I watched his face while he's asked it, and there was something underneath the asking that I could not locate precisely. Not jealousy, not suspicion, something closer to need, like a man checking that the people he trusted were still standing where he left them. "I'll call her this afternoon," I said. "She's coming soon." He nodded again, closed his eyes. I sat with him until his breathing evened out. That evening, I drove to my sister's house, ate half a plate of food I did not taste, and sat at the kitchen table alone after she went to bed. I took the business card from my purse. I had looked at the front twice already. The name still meant nothing. The Nashville address still meant nothing. But something made me turn it over again. Something that had been sitting at the back of my mind since the moment I found it. The handwriting on the back was small and careful, deliberate. A person who wrote like they did not want to be misread. One word I did not recognize. A phone number beneath it. And below that, in the same careful hand, the name of Cassius's LLC. I sat very still at that kitchen table. The house was quiet. My sister's clock ticked on the wall. I put the card face down and stared at nothing for a long time. Ondine called at 4:30 to confirm she was coming in the morning. Her voice was warm and certain the way it always was. The kind of certainty that comes from having already made every arrangement. She said she would be there by 10. She said she was looking forward to seeing me. She said to get some rest. I told her I would. I meant it when I said it. By 7, I had sat with Cassius through his evening medication, watched him drift into the shallow sleep that had replaced real sleep, and gathered my coat and bag from the chair. I was tired in the specific way that grief makes you tired, not in your body but somewhere behind it. I stopped at Cornelius's doorway to say goodnight the way I had started doing without deciding to. He was not settled the way I expected. He was sitting forward, both hands gripping the bed rail. His eyes found me the moment I appeared in the doorway, and something in them stopped me before I could speak. Not distress exactly. Something more controlled than distress. Something that had been waiting. Cornelius. I stepped inside. You all right? He did not answer the question. He watched me cross the room, and when I was close enough, he reached out and took hold of my arm. Not a gentle touch, a grip, firm and deliberate in a way that did not belong to a sick old man making conversation. He pulled me close, and he whispered directly into my ear, "Drive home tonight if you can." I pulled back and looked at his face. He held my gaze without flinching. Steady, serious, carrying something heavy behind his eyes that he was not going to explain. Then he said something else, quiet, almost swallowed by the sound of the air vent above us. They move differently when family leaves overnight. Before I could respond, he released my arm, turned toward his window, folded his hands in his lap as though nothing had happened. I stood in that room and waited for more. Nothing came. I walked into the corridor and stood there in the quiet hum of the building, trying to locate what had just moved through me. It was not fear exactly. It was the particular feeling of a word landing before you understand its meaning. Your body knowing something your mind has not caught up to yet. Drive home tonight if you can. Not be safe. Not take care of yourself. Not any of the things a lonely old man says to the woman who brings him muffins. Those 4 words were specific, they were pointed, and the second sentence unsettled me even more. They move differently when family leaves overnight. Who was they, staff? Visitors. Whoever had been walking those corridors after midnight. I could not tell whether Cornelius was warning me about something real, or whether long nights inside hospice had taught him to see patterns in ordinary movement. But the certainty in his voice had not sounded confused. It had sounded experienced. I called my sister. I told her I was staying the night. She asked if everything was all right. I said yes, I was not sure that was true. I pulled the small recliner close to Cassius's bed and sat in the dark with my coat still on and my bag on the floor beside me. Cassius's breathing was slow and even. The building had gone quiet the way buildings go quiet after 10. Settled, dim, the kind of silence that makes every sound that breaks it mean something. Twice during the night, someone checked Cassius's room without entering. A pause at the door, a shadow against the narrow glass panel, then movement again. I told myself that was normal. Hospice staff monitored patients through the night. Family members wandered corridors unable to sleep. Security made rounds. There were reasonable explanations for almost everything happening around me. But reasonable things do not usually leave your chest this tight. I closed my eyes. At 2 in the morning, I opened them. Footsteps in the corridor, slow, deliberate. Not the quick, purposeful walk of a nurse on a wellness check. Something unhurried. Something that paused, briefly, barely, outside Cassius's door before continuing. Then outside Cornelius's door, then nothing. I sat in the dark with my hand pressed flat against my chest and did not move for a very long time. Ondine arrived at 10 minutes past 10, carrying a travel bag in one hand and a leather folder tucked under her other arm. I watched her walk through Cassius's door, and I want to be honest about what I saw, because I have asked myself this question many times since. Was her grief real? And the answer is yes, completely. She set everything down and went straight to him and took his face in both hands the way a woman does when she has been afraid to see something and is relieved that it is not worse. She whispered something I could not hear. He opened his eyes, and the smallest smile moved across his face. Whatever was between them was real. I had no doubt about that. But the folder was real too. It sat on the chair where she had placed it before crossing to his bed. Brown leather. Structured sides. The kind that holds papers flat and protected. The kind you bring when you need signatures, not comfort. I noticed it, the way you notice something that does not quite belong in a room and cannot immediately say why. I said nothing. I poured water. I straightened the already straight blanket at Cassius's feet. I was present and useful, and completely focused on that folder, without looking at it directly. A man appeared in the corridor. He was visible through the narrow glass panel set into the door, the strip of window that let staff check on patients without entering. He was not staff. His clothes were too considered for that. Dark jacket, no lanyard, no clipboard. He stood at the glass for just a moment, long enough to look once into the room, and then he was gone, unhurried, as though he had seen exactly what he came to see. I kept my face still. But something about the sighting stayed with me longer than it should have. Hospice facilities receive visitors constantly: pastors, accountants, distant cousins, insurance representatives, attorneys carrying folders and careful expressions. Rationally, there was nothing strange about a well-dressed man standing in a corridor outside a patient's room, except he had not looked like family. And he had not looked lost either. 20 minutes later, Ondine stepped out to speak with one of the nurses about Cassius's care schedule. I heard her voice in the corridor, warm, engaged, asking the right questions. She was going to be a few minutes at least. I looked at the folder. I did not open it. I will not pretend I am the kind of woman who goes through another person's private documents in her dying son's hospice room. I am not. But I crossed to the chair and I looked at it. The top edge of a document was visible where the folder had not been fully closed. White paper. Standard print. In the upper left corner, clear as anything, the name of Cassius's LLC. I stepped back, sat down, folded my hands in my lap. Ondine returned 2 minutes later, and we talked about Cassius's appetite, and whether he was sleeping, and what the doctor had said on his last round. We talked like two women who loved the same man, because we were. Because that was still true, regardless of anything else. At one point, she touched the folder lightly and said, almost apologetically, "There are some account things Cass wanted me to help organize while he's still alert enough to answer questions." I nodded, like that explanation settled everything. Part of me wanted it too. I excused myself at 11:30, told them I needed some air. The parking lot behind Gracewood was half full, nurses changing shifts, family visitors smoking beside their cars, the ordinary movement of people carrying difficult days. I stood near the curb and let the cold air settle me. Then I saw him again. Not close this time. Near the far end of the lot beside a dark blue sedan, the same dark jacket, same deliberate pace. He opened the driver's door without looking around and paused briefly before getting inside, one hand resting on the roof of the car, like a man finishing a thought before leaving. I could not see his face clearly from that distance. But something about him tightened the same place inside me. The corridor sighting had tightened earlier. Not fear exactly. Recognition without context. He got into the sedan and pulled out slowly, dark blue, newer model, Tennessee plates. I caught the first 3 letters before the car turned toward the exit and disappeared behind the hedges lining the drive. I stood there longer than I meant to. Then I pressed those 3 letters into my memory anyway. Because by then, instinct had already started doing work my mind had not caught up to yet. I did not sleep. I lay in the dark at my sister's house with my eyes open and let everything move through me in the order it had happened. The business card with the handwriting on the back. The LLC name on the document edge inside that folder. The man at the glass panel who looked once and left, the whisper in the corridor. The footsteps at 2 a.m. pausing outside 2 doors. None of it connected into anything I could name. But it had stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like weight, the kind that presses on your chest from the inside and will not shift regardless of how you position yourself. I was back at Gracewood by 7:45. Adrienne Locke was on shift. I had seen her before. Efficient, pleasant, the kind of nurse who moves through a room without disturbing it. But I watched her differently that morning, not because I had decided she was guilty of something. Because once suspicion enters your mind, you begin studying ordinary things for evidence they were never meant to carry. I watched the way she checked Cassius's IV line, the way she noted his chart, the way she spoke to him even knowing he was asleep. Professionally warm, the words correct, the cadence practiced. Too practiced. There is a difference between a person who is good at their job and a person performing being good at their job. I had spent 31 years in schools learning to see that difference in people half Adrienne Locke's age. It lives in the small things. The half-second delay before the natural response. The eyes that confirm rather than discover. Or maybe grief had simply made me suspicious of everyone standing near my son. I did not fully trust myself anymore on that point. I waited until she was finished, and then I said, casually, the way you say things when you do not want the other person to know you are listening to their answer. Can you walk me through his medication schedule? Just so I understand what he's receiving and when. Her answer was correct, thorough, even. But her eyes went somewhere else while she gave it. Not to the chart, not to me. Somewhere past my left shoulder for just a breath before returning. Of course, Miss Hale, she said. We want you to feel informed. I thanked her. She left. I sat with what I had just seen and did not move for several minutes. That afternoon, I crossed the hall. Cornelius had finished his lunch and was sitting in his usual position, upright, hands folded, oriented toward the window. We talked about small things. The weather turning. Whether Nashville had ever had a summer that did not arrive like punishment. He was quieter than usual, but present in the way he had learned to be present with me, attentive without performing it. When I stood to leave, he said, without looking away from the window, "You remind me of my daughter. She was a school principal. Didn't miss a thing either." I smiled faintly. Children will train your eyes for that. The words left my mouth automatically. Conversational, harmless. Then I stepped into the corridor. And something slowed inside my head. I had talked before about children, about parents, about spending years around people long enough to learn what they were not saying. Enough, maybe, for an observant man to make assumptions. Maybe even enough for him to guess education, administration, something close to it. But the certainty in the way he had said it stayed with me. Not because it was impossible, because it was precise. I turned around. His eyes were already closed, hands still folded, breathing even, as though he had said nothing at all. I stood in that doorway for a long moment. The corridor hummed quietly around me. A cart rolled past somewhere further down the hall. Then another thought arrived behind the first one. Cornelius spent most of his days facing that corridor. Nurses talked openly at stations. Staff exchanged details in passing. Families spoke in waiting areas believing no one was listening. In places like Gracewood, information traveled lightly, quietly, sometimes without anyone noticing it move. And there was something else now too. Something I had not considered before. People who spend enough time around grief become students of behavior. They learn to watch rooms carefully, to notice tension before words reach it, to pay attention to who walks into corridors and why. That should have settled me. Instead, it unsettled me more. Because whether Cornelius had guessed, overheard, or simply has observed too carefully, the feeling underneath it remained the same, that people inside that building were seeing more than they should. I turned back and kept walking, but I was slower now. And I was thinking harder than I had since the morning I first walked through those one-way doors. Because something in that building knew more than it was saying. I called Lydia Cross from the parking lot of a gas station 2 blocks from Gracewood because I did not want to make this call inside that building. Lydia and I had known each other for 11 years through Greater Emmanuel Baptist. She had handled my husband Gerald's estate after he passed, quietly, thoroughly, without ever making me feel like a widow being managed. She was the kind of attorney who returned calls the same day and told you the truth before she told you what you wanted to hear. I trusted her the way you trust someone who has already seen you at your worst and handled it with dignity. She picked up on the third ring. "Lydia," I said, "I need someone to look at something." Not urgently. I kept my voice son's affairs. I just want to make sure everything is in order, while he can still confirm his wishes. A pause. "What are you seeing, Dovie?" "I don't know yet. That's why I need you to look." She did not ask another question. She said, "Send me what you have. I'll start pulling public records this afternoon." 30 years in Tennessee estate law meant she had filing system access and state-level contacts that most attorneys spent careers building. A preliminary read was not a matter of days for Lydia Cross. It was a matter of hours. I sent her everything. A photograph of the business card front and back, the LLC name I had seen on the document edge inside the folder, and what I remembered of Cassius's financial structure from years of conversations. His brokerage accounts, the LLC holding his 2 investment properties, the life insurance policy he had taken out when he and Ondine married. Then I went back inside and sat with my son. He was awake by early evening. The good kind of awake, present, clear-eyed, the version of Cassius that still felt entirely like himself. He asked about the weather. He asked whether I had eaten. I told him yes to both, even though only one was true. Then I said carefully, Cass, your affairs. The accounts, the LLC, everything is properly set up. He looked at me with those steady eyes. Everything's handled, Mama. Undine knows what to do. He said it the way a man says something he has repeated to himself enough times that it has become fact. Complete confidence. Zero hesitation. I held his hand and said, good, that's good, baby. I did not tell him about the business card. I did not tell him about the folder, or the man in the parking lot, or what Cornelius had said. I sat with him and talked about nothing that mattered until his eyes grew heavy, and his breathing slowed, and he was gone again into that shallow, restless sleep. I kissed his forehead and walked out. My phone rang at 8:47, Lydia. I answered before the second ring finished. I've only done a preliminary pull, she said. Her voice was measured in the way it gets when she is controlling something. But Dovey, a pause that lasted exactly long enough to change the temperature of everything. Someone has been preparing transfer documents on this LLC for weeks. Active filings. Recent dates. Another pause. Cassius did not initiate them. I stood in the corridor outside my son's room, with the phone pressed to my ear, and the sound of his breathing coming faint through the door behind me. I did not say anything for a long moment. Then I said, keep pulling. 2 days passed before Lydia called again. I know people think investigations move fast. They do not. They move the way truth moves. Carefully, through layers. One document leading to another document, leading to a name that leads to another name. Lydia had been methodical her entire career. I did not rush her. I sat with Cassius. I brought Cornelius muffins. I watched Adrian Locke move through my son's room and kept my face completely still. On the third evening, Lydia called and asked me to find somewhere quiet. I walked to the small family sitting room at the end of the corridor, the one with the window that looked out over the parking lot, and the 2 chairs nobody ever used. I closed the door and sat down. 2 documents, she said. LLC membership transfer and a life insurance beneficiary redesignation. Both prepared within the last 6 weeks. Both requiring Undine's signature to execute. She paused. Neither one was initiated by Cassius. I pressed my hand flat against my knee and said nothing. The documents redirect everything into a private holding entity, not Undine directly. A structured entity. My investigator spent the better part of 2 days tracing the registration. It runs through layered filings and registered agents before you reach the controlling name. Another pause. The kind Lydia uses when she wants you to be ready. The name is Foster Gaines. I did not recognize it. I told her so. Private estate consultant. Nashville-based. Legitimate-looking operation on paper. Her voice was careful. Flat in the way that means the opposite of flat. He structures these entities in ways that are difficult to trace quickly. My investigator only got there because he'd similar shielding methods in probate disputes before. I reached into my bag. My fingers found the business card without me having to look. I had moved it to the same pocket every day since I found it. I turned it over. The handwritten number on the back. I read it to Lydia without explaining why. Silence. Then Dovey. That number is in Foster Gaines's entity filing. It's a contact line registered to his operation. I sat with that for a moment. The business card had been on Cassius's bedside table. Someone had put it there. Someone who had been in that room or had access to that room and wanted what? Wanted Cassius to call it, wanted Undine to find it, wanted something to move in a particular direction, or maybe wanted the number available before decisions had to be made quickly. The documents need Undine's signature, I said. Yes, she hasn't signed them yet, not according to anything filed, no. The execution hasn't happened, which meant there was still time, which meant whoever was behind this was still waiting for the right moment, which meant the folder Undine had carried in, the one she had not opened in front of me, was still carrying unsigned papers. I looked out the window at the dark parking lot below. Empty spaces. Overhead lights making yellow pools on the asphalt. And for the first time since this started, something else settled in beside the fear. Structure. This was not random greed moving chaotically through a grieving family. It was organized, timed, patient, the corridor man, the business card, the carefully prepared documents waiting for a signature window. None of it felt improvised anymore. Lydia, I kept my voice even. Who brought Foster Gaines into contact with Cassius's financial information in the first place? Someone gave him the details, the LLC structure, the policy, the account positions. That is not public record. Someone who knew handed it over. Lydia was quiet for a moment. I don't know yet, she said. But whoever it was had inside visibility. These documents were prepared with too much specificity to come from guesswork. I nodded at the window. Find out. I called Odell Parrish on a Thursday morning from the same gas station 2 blocks from Gracewood. I had learned by then that certain calls needed distance from that building. Not because I was afraid of being overheard. Because I needed to be able to think clearly while I talked, and something about those corridors made clear thinking difficult. Too much grief in the walls. Too much weight in the air. Odell picked up on the second ring. We exchanged the brief warmth of people who have known each other through enough hard seasons that hello carries history inside it. Then I said, Pastor, have you visited Cassius recently? 2 weeks ago Tuesday, he said. Sat with him about 40 minutes. Did you see anything unusual while you were there? Anyone in the corridor who didn't seem like they belonged? A pause. Longer than a thinking pause. The kind that means yes and is deciding how to frame it. There was a man, Odell said slowly. Standing outside Cassius's room, not inside, outside, at the corridor, well-dressed, dark jacket. He wasn't moving with any purpose, just. Another pause. I assumed he was some kind of consultant, medical or financial. People bring those in situations like this. I kept my voice level. What did he look like? Odell described medium height, solid build. The kind of man whose clothes were chosen to suggest authority without announcing it. Unhurried in the way of someone who is exactly where he intended to be. Then Odell added quietly, he looked at me once when I came out of Cassius's room, nodded like we were both there for business. That tightened something low in my chest. It was the same man, the corridor, parking lot, the dark blue sedan. Odell, I said, I need you to come to Gracewood tomorrow. Walk me through exactly where you saw him and when. He did not ask why. He said, I'll be there at 10. I sat with that for a moment after we ended the call. Then my phone buzzed. Lydia. She did not open with pleasantries. I found the connection, she said. Foster Gaines and Cortland Arsenault, Ondine's brother. She let that land before continuing. Financial correspondence between them going back 14 months. My investigator pulled a paper trail that puts them in the same room in Memphis. A business registration conference tied to elder estate planning firms. Their names appear together through a vendor access filing. A pause. Cortland brought Foster the profile, account structures, LLC positions, policy details, information that could only have come from inside the family. I closed my eyes. Cortland. I had met him twice. A man who shook your hand firmly and smiled with his whole face and asked questions about you that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. The kind of man who had learned that charm was a door that opened everything. Ondine's brother. Ondine, who was upstairs right now, sitting beside her dying husband with a leather folder she had not yet opened in front of me. Ondine, who called me Dovey instead of Miss Hale from the very first day. Ondine, who had no idea. I was certain of this in the way you are certain of things you cannot yet prove, that her own brother had handed her husband's financial life to a predator 14 months ago. Lydia, I said carefully, are we sure this wasn't legitimate financial planning at first? Possibly at first, she said, but not anymore. The transfer structures changed 6 weeks ago. That's when the beneficiary language shifted and the holding entities appeared. Before that, the correspondence reads like ordinary financial access conversations. After that, it doesn't. That mattered, because predators rarely arrive, looking like predators at the beginning. I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long time. The engine was off. The windows were fogging slightly at the edges. Outside, the ordinary world moved past. A nurse on a break, a delivery van pulling in, a man walking with his hands in his pockets going nowhere fast. Ondine did not know. Or if she did, she had hidden it flawlessly through the worst weeks of her husband's life. I did not believe that was true, and tomorrow I had to decide what to do with that. I asked Ondine to walk with me to the family sitting room at the end of the corridor. I did not tell her why. I said I needed a few minutes, and would she mind, and she said of course, and followed me with the easy trust of a woman who had no reason yet to brace herself. She was wearing Cassius's favorite color that day, a deep burgundy that he had always said suited her. I noticed that, and it made what I was about to do considerably harder. I closed the door. We sat across from each other in the two chairs nobody ever used. I had the documents Lydia had sent to my phone, screenshots, filings, the paper trail laid out in the careful sequence of someone who knew how to build a case that could not be argued with. I said, Ondine, I need to show you something. And I need you to know before I do that, none of what I'm about to say is about you. She looked at me steadily. Okay. I showed her the LLC transfer documents I watched her read. Her brow pulled together slightly, the expression of someone encountering something that does not yet compute. Then I showed her the beneficiary redesignation. Then I showed her the entity registration, tracing back through 2 layers of paperwork to Foster Gaines. Then I showed her the correspondence, the third-party filing that placed Foster Gaines and Cortland Arsenault in the same room in Memphis 14 months ago. I watched her face move through it in stages. Confusion first, genuine and unguarded, the look of a person reading words that refuse to arrange themselves into sense. Then something shifted underneath the confusion, a recognition she did not want. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes went still in the way. Eyes go still when the mind behind them is doing something very controlled and very painful. She did not speak for a long time. I did not fill the silence. I had learned across 31 years of working with people that some silences need to be survived, not managed. When she finally looked up, her eyes were dry. Not because she was not devastated. Because whatever was moving through her had gone somewhere too deep for tears to reach yet. He called me 3 weeks ago, she said quietly. Cortland. He said he'd been talking to a financial consultant, someone who could help manage things during. He said it was what Cassius would want. She stopped. Her hands were flat on her thighs. I thought he was trying to help. I know, I said. He knew everything. The LLC, the policy, the accounts. Her voice dropped further. I told him, over the years. When things were good, I talked about our life, and he listened, and I thought, she stopped again. She did not defend him. She did not reach for an excuse or a context that softened it. She sat with the full weight of it, the way a woman sits, when she understands that love was the door someone used to walk through and take everything. The silence held for another long moment. Then she looked at me directly and said, "What do you need from me?" Not a question she was afraid of. A question she had already decided to answer before she finished asking it. I held her gaze. I need you to call Cortland. Tell him nothing has changed. Tell him everything is moving forward exactly as planned. I paused. I need him to believe he has already won. Ondine looked at me for one steady moment. Then she picked up her phone. The question that had been sitting beneath everything else finally had room to breathe. Cassius's decline was faster than it should have been. The doctors had given us a timeline, and his body was not following it, not in the direction of recovery, which nobody expected, but in the direction of deterioration. The pace was wrong. I had felt it from the second week and filed it under grief's tendency to distort time. But grief does not change medication records. Grief does not alter administration schedules. And a pattern is a pattern regardless of how quietly it accumulates. Cassius had a lucid window that morning. Clear eyes, full sentences. I sat close and kept my voice easy and said, "Baby, I need to request your medical records. Full records. To make sure everything is being managed right. Can I do that on your behalf?" He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." I walked him to the nurse's station. He was not strong enough to go far, but he was present enough to matter. And I had his verbal authorization witnessed by the charge nurse on duty. Then I submitted a formal request through the facility's patient advocate for Cassius's complete medication administration records. It took 4 hours to process. I sat with Cassius and waited and did not show him my hands because they were not entirely steady. Lydia's medical contact was a retired physician named Dr. Okafor, who had worked with her on 3 prior estate cases involving disputed medical timelines. She reached him by noon. By evening, he had the records and Dovey's written authorization to review them. He called me at 9:15. "There are discrepancies," he said. "Careful, precise. The voice of a man who does not use words carelessly. Medication administration times that do not align with the prescribed schedule. Dosage windows that were extended beyond protocol on specific dates. Individually, each one falls within the range of human error." A pause. Together they form a pattern, across 6 weeks. consistent enough that I would not call it error. I closed my eyes briefly and listened. Then he added, very carefully, to be clear, Miss Hale, nothing in these records suggests medication caused your son's condition. Hospice patients decline. That is the reality of hospice. But these deviations could absolutely reduce alerts, increase sedation windows, and limit moments of cognitive clarity during critical decision-making periods. I thanked him. I wrote down every date he gave me. Then I folded the paper and put it in my bag next to the business card that had started all of this. The next morning, I asked Adrienne Locke if she had a few minutes. I said it pleasantly. She hesitated before answering. Not long, just enough for me to notice. Then she said, "Of course." I led her to the family sitting room, the same room where Ondine and I had sat 2 days before, and I closed the door and I put the printed records on the table between us. I did not say anything at first. I simply let her look. Adrienne's face stayed professional for a long moment, composed, practiced. The same face she showed Cassius's room every morning. 38 seconds, 40. Then she pushed the papers slightly back toward me. "I follow physician instructions," she said evenly. "If you have concerns about your son's care, you need to take them through administration." I nodded once. "Administration already knows records were requested," I said quietly. "Dr. Okafor reviewed them last night. Lydia Cross has copies. So does a medical investigator she works with." I kept my eyes on hers. "This room is the opportunity I'm giving you, before other people start asking questions you may not want to answer without representation." Something shifted behind her eyes then. Not panic, calculation. Fear arriving carefully, her gaze moved toward the door. Then back to the records, her hands flattened against the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than before. "Has administration contacted anyone yet?" It was not denial that mattered. "Not formally," I said. "Not yet." She sat back slowly. The breath that left her did not sound relieved. It sounded exhausted. "Foster Gaines approached me 4 months ago," she said, "through a family contact." She swallowed once. "He said it was about timing paperwork correctly, about making sure there were no delays if things changed quickly." Her eyes closed briefly. "At first it was small adjustments, nothing outside acceptable ranges. Then it became more frequent." I said nothing. "I never administered anything outside prescribed medication," she said quickly, like she needed that fact to remain standing somewhere in the room between us. "But I knew the timing patterns weren't accidental anymore." The silence stretched. Then she looked directly at me for the first time since sitting down. "I hired an attorney yesterday," she whispered. "I think part of me knew this was coming." I held her gaze steadily. "You're going to give me everything," I said. "Every date, every instruction, every point of contact." Adrienne's very still. Then she nodded once. She said, "I will." Adrienne gave me everything she had. She sat in that family room for 40 minutes, and she talked, and I wrote down every word in the small notebook I had started carrying in my bag the same day I found the business card. Dates, instructions, the method Foster Gaines had used to reach her. Not through the facility, not through any official channel. Through Cortland, who had presented Foster as a family friend managing Cassius's affairs and asked Adrienne, as a favor, to make certain adjustments to the administration schedule. Small ones, nothing that would read as intentional on any single review. Just enough, across enough weeks to move a timeline. She had needed money. She had told herself it was not really hurting anyone. She had been wrong and she had known it and kept going anyway, and now she was sitting across from me in a room that smelled like industrial carpet and bad coffee, telling me everything because the alternative was carrying it alone for the rest of her life. I passed everything to Lydia that same afternoon. Lydia took Adrienne's information to 2 people simultaneously. A medical investigator with experience in hospice fraud cases and a litigation attorney who had spent 15 years building cases against financial predators operating in estate law. Both moved quickly, not because cases like this are simple. Because cases like this leave paper, and paper does not lie if you know where to look. What they found took 3 days. Foster Gaines had done this before. Not once, twice. Different cities, different families. Same architecture. An asset-rich family caught in a moment of maximum grief. Transfer documents prepared without the principal's knowledge. A holding entity structured to obscure the destination of redirected funds. The first family had settled quietly under a non-disclosure agreement, that had cost them their legal voice and a significant portion of what they had lost. The second family had signed documents they did not understand and only realized what had happened 8 months after the death, when an accountant flagged the beneficiary discrepancy. Foster had never been charged. He had moved always in the space just inside the legal line, close enough to the edge that each individual action could be explained, far enough from outright fraud that no single case had been enough to hold him. Until now, there had never been 3. Lydia's investigator surfaced both prior cases through financial filing patterns, the same holding entity structure appearing across different jurisdictions under slightly different names. He reached both families directly. The first family, who had signed a non-disclosure, had a consultation with their own attorney before responding. The second family called back within 2 hours. Both agreed to come forward. For the first time, Foster Gaines was not one family's word against a carefully constructed paper operation. He was a pattern, documented, witnessed. 3 instances of the same predatory structure, targeting grieving families who trusted the wrong people at the worst possible moment. Lydia called me on a Tuesday evening and said, "Dovie, we have enough to move." I stood at the window of my sister's kitchen and looked out at the dark yard and thought about a man who had spent years finding families at their lowest and taking everything that was not nailed down. "Not yet," I said. Lydia paused. "What are you waiting for?" I turned away from the window. "Cortland," I said. "I want him in the room when it happens. I want him to watch every door close at the same time." Silence on the line. Then Lydia said, "I'll be ready." Ondine made the call on a Wednesday morning from the chair beside Cassius's bed. I stood in the corridor and listened to her voice through the partially open door. Warm, easy, the natural rhythm of a sister, talking to a brother she had trusted her entire life. She told him the documents were ready. She told him she needed him there to help her through it. She said, and this was the part that required something from her, "I do not think I could have managed. I just don't want to do this alone, Cortland. You know how I get." He said he would be there by Thursday afternoon. She ended the call and sat for a moment with the phone in her lap. Then she looked up at me through the doorway. I nodded once. She nodded back. That was all. By then, Lydia had already made contact with the Tennessee Financial Crimes Unit through an investigator she had worked alongside on a prior probate exploitation case. Agent Reeves had reviewed the preliminary documentation the night before. The transfer structures, Adrian's statement, the beneficiary redesignations, the prior filing patterns tied to Foster Gaines. Enough to justify presence. Enough to move carefully before assets disappeared into layered entities. Lydia had arranged the room carefully. A conference space at her firm, not the hospice. Not anywhere that carried the weight of what was already happening inside Gracewood. A table, chairs, the transfer documents and beneficiary redesignation papers laid out in plain view, exactly as Cortland would expect to see them. Lydia and I sat on one side. The third woman in the room, a representative from the Tennessee State Financial Crimes Unit named Agent Reeves, sat slightly apart, her credentials face down on the table. Her presence readable only if you were looking for it. Cortland was not looking for it. He walked in at 2:30 on Thursday, dark jacket. The firm handshake. The full-faced smile that I now understood was a door he had learned to open with his whole body. He saw the documents on the table and his shoulders settled. The specific relaxation of a man arriving exactly where he expected to arrive. He pulled out a chair. He said, "Dovie, I'm glad you're here. This is what Cassius would want, getting everything properly handled." He said it to me directly. Warm, certain. The voice of a man who had rehearsed his own innocence so many times it had started to sound like truth. He kept talking. He referenced the holding entity by name. He referenced the timeline. He said the word transfer twice before his eyes moved to Agent Reeves and stayed there. The room changed temperature. I watched it happen across his face. The slow, terrible recalibration of a man understanding that the floor he was standing on was not the floor he had walked in expecting. His eyes moved to the credentials on the table, then to Lydia, then to me. I did not look away. He did not speak again for a long time. When he finally did, his voice had lost everything that made it charming. What was left was just a man calculating what cooperation might cost him versus what resistance would. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Depends on how much Foster or not denial." Not outrage. That told me everything. He chose cooperation. Foster Gaines was contacted by authorities that same afternoon. By Thursday evening, Cassius's LLC and both beneficiary designations were formally locked and protected under a legal hold that no document Foster had prepared could touch. It was done. I drove back to Gracewood alone. I walked the corridor slowly. When I reached Cornelius's room, I stopped. The bed was empty, stripped and remade. Nothing on the windowsill, nothing on the walls, as though he had never been there. I found a staff member at the nurse's station and asked about him. She checked her screen and said he had been discharged that morning. Then she said, almost as an afterthought, he was particular about his room, actually. When he was admitted, he specifically asked to be placed on this corridor. Said he liked being near long-stay family visitors. She smiled faintly. Told me once he'd spent a long time sitting beside somebody he loved in a place a lot like this. Said you learn things when you stay overnight in hospice long enough. Something cold moved quietly through me. Not because it sounded mysterious, because suddenly it sounded human. I stood at that nurse's station for a long moment. Then I walked back down the corridor toward my son's room, and I did not have a single word for what I was feeling. There was nothing left to fight. Foster Gaines was under formal investigation. Cortland was cooperating with authorities in the careful, measured way of a man trying to reduce what was coming for him. Adrian Locke had been suspended pending a full hospice review. The documents were nullified. The accounts were protected. Everything Cassius had built across 15 years of disciplined, quiet work was exactly where he had intended it to be, and my son was dying. That was the thing that had been true from the first morning. I walked him through those one-way doors, and it was still true now with everything else resolved and cleared away. The fight had given me somewhere to put the grief. Now there was nowhere left to put it. It simply sat in the room with us, heavy and without apology, the way grief sits when it has been patient long enough. I did not bring my notebook. I did not bring the business card or the photographs of the documents or any of the architecture of the last several weeks. I brought nothing into that room on Friday morning except myself. I sat in the chair beside his bed, and I took his hand and I stayed. Ondine was on the other side. We did not talk much. Not to each other, not to him. We existed in the particular silence of two women who have been through something together that neither of them will ever fully explain to anyone who was not there. Occasionally, her eyes would meet mine across the bed and something would pass between us that did not have a name and did not need one. I talked to him when the silence became something I needed to fill. I told him about the summer he was 7 years old and convinced himself he could build a functioning go-kart from materials he found in the garage. I told him about the school play, where he had 3 lines and delivered all of them to the back wall because I had told him to project, and he had taken that literally. I told him about the morning he called me from his first apartment to ask how long you boil an egg, and I had laughed so hard I had to sit down. I told him what he had built. Not the accounts or the LLC or the investment properties. Those were the evidence of who he was, not the substance of it. I told him about the kind of man he had become, the patience he had developed, the way he loved Ondine, steadily, without performance, the way his father had loved me, the way he called every Sunday without being asked. Ondine cried quietly at some point in the afternoon. I handed her tissues and kept my hand on Cassius's and did not look away from his face. The light in the room changed as evening came in. The particular gold of late afternoon, moving through the window and settling across the bed, the way light settles when it has nowhere else to be. At 6:30, his eyes opened, not the partial, effortful opening of recent days, fully open, present. He looked directly at me with an expression I recognized, the same expression he had worn at 7 years old, presenting that broken go-kart with complete dignity, regardless of the outcome. Mama, his voice was thin but certain. Did you handle it? I squeezed his hand. I leaned close. Baby, I said. I handled everything. He looked at me for a long moment. Then something his face released. Not weakness, not surrender, relief. The specific relief of a man who built something and needed to know it would stand after him. His eyes closed. I held his hand and did not let go. Cassius passed at 4:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was holding his hand when it happened, and I looked at the clock on the wall, the way you look at something when you need to mark a moment that cannot be unmarked. 4:17, a Friday. The room was quiet, and the light was the particular gray of very early morning, and Ondine was on the other side of him, with her head bowed and her hand over his, and neither of us spoke for a very long time. There is nothing I can tell you about grief that grief has not already told you itself. It arrives the way it arrives. It does not negotiate, and it does not soften itself for your convenience, and it does not care that you have been bracing for it for weeks. It lands the same way regardless. I sat beside my son's bed in that gray morning light and I let it land. The days after moved the way those days always move, slowly and too fast at the same time. Arrangements, phone calls, the particular exhaustion of having to speak coherently about loss, while loss is still sitting on your chest. Ondine was beside me through all of it, not performing strength, just present. The way women are present for each other, when words have run out, and presence is the only thing left that means anything. The estate was intact. Everything Cassius had built across 15 years survived him exactly as he had intended. His accounts, his LLC, his properties, his life insurance flowing to the people he had chosen, without a single document redirected, without a single signature extracted under grief. Foster Gaines faced formal charges. Both prior families had come forward, and the three-case pattern gave prosecutors what no single case had ever provided: a documented methodology, a repeated structure. A predator who had finally run out of room to operate just inside the legal line. Cortland was cooperating with authorities. Ondine had made her decision about her brother quietly and without drama, and she had not revisited it. Adrienne Locke faced a medical board review that would determine the remainder of her professional life. It was over. On the last morning, before I left Nashville, I drove to Gracewood alone. I did not go to Cassius's room. I had said what I needed to say there. I walked the corridor slowly, and I stopped outside the room across the hall, empty, stripped and remade the way it had been the evening I first came back and found Cornelius gone. Nothing on the windowsill, nothing on the walls. I stood there, and I thought about a man named Cornelius Draft who had bad nights and no visitors and eyes that tracked every footstep in that corridor, with the quiet attention of someone who had learned that what moves in the dark matters. The nurse at the station recognized the name when I asked about him again. She said, softly this time, his wife died in hospice 3 years ago. Different facility. She adjusted a stack of papers while she spoke. He told me once there were problems with paperwork around the end. Financial people coming in and out after she lost clarity. A pause. I think he blamed himself for leaving her alone too often near the end. I said nothing. Because suddenly, I understood why he watched corridors the way other people watch storms forming over water. I thought about what he had carried into that room with him. Whatever guilt, whatever memory, whatever knowing, made him position himself on that specific corridor and pay attention when other people stopped paying attention. I thought about peach muffins that cost me nothing. I thought about 4 words that cost him the reopening of something painful enough, that he had carried it for 3 years into another hospice room. You cannot always see where your kindness lands. You send it out without a return address, and you keep moving because that is what you do. But sometimes, in the rarest moments life offers, it finds you back, not wrapped, not announced. Just a grip on your arm in a dim corridor and 4 words from a man who had every reason to stay silent and chose not to. I almost drove home. Grief will do that. Make you want your own walls when everything is falling apart somewhere else. But I stayed. And staying turned out to be the most important thing I ever did for my son, besides raising him.